The fog clung to the embankment like a living thing, heavy and reluctant to release the last echoes of footsteps that had long since disappeared into the night. Paris breathed in silence, her streets glistening with the residue of rain, her shutters closed as though she wished to guard her secrets. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret stood at his office window, pipe embers glowing faintly, watching the black surface of the Seine ripple with the current. Somewhere in that darkness a name was written on a false passport, a name that did not belong to the man who carried it, and yet it had opened doors, raised suspicions, and now, inevitably, drawn him here. The case had not yet a face, only a document that lied, and Maigret, who had spent his life listening to the murmur of men's half-truths, who had learned that paper could deceive as much as a smile, felt the stirrings of unease he could not name. For each case began like this, a foggy outline, a contradiction, a shadow that promised to lead into depths where truth waited, stubborn and silent, until one had the patience to coax it forth. Before we descend fully into this story of lies and identities, pause a moment with Maigret at the window. If you find yourself drawn into the silence, into the slow unraveling of a world where every shadow carries a whisper, then allow this channel to remain your companion. Subscribe, share, let others find their way into these fog-draped stories. It keeps the lamp burning as we follow Maigret through the night. The rain had stopped only an hour before dawn, leaving the streets of Paris glistening like old glass. A few lanterns still burned, their halos trembling in the morning mist, and the echo of hooves from a lone cab drifted over the cobblestones. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the river pressed against the quay with a muted strength, carrying debris from upstream. Branches, a torn sack, a single child's shoe spinning round before sinking. From his office, Maigret watched the river's indifferent flow, his pipe clamped in the corner of his mouth, the smell of stale tobacco mixing with the damp air that crept in through the slightly open window. He had not slept, though his heavy body could have done with rest. Something had stirred him awake in the night, some quiet insistence of the case that had been laid before him the evening prior. The passport lay on his desk, its cover dark blue, the emblem of a foreign nation pressed in gold. It was not the first false document Maigret had seen. Over the years he had held in his hands passports too clumsily forged, others so carefully prepared that only the faintest irregularity betrayed them. Yet this one was different. It had been discovered in the pocket of a man found unconscious in a modest boarding house off the Rue de la Roquette. A quarrel, the landlord said, too much drink, the kind that ends in fists. But the landlord had seen the police papers often enough to know when to call for help. The man had been carried to the hospital, breathing heavily, his face swollen, his name mumbled but hardly convincing. What troubled Maigret was not simply the forgery, but the precision with which it had been made. Every page carried stamps from border stations, signatures in fading ink, watermarks that shifted in the light. To the untrained eye, it was perfect. Even to his own, it might have passed, if not for one detail: the paper. It was too new, too white, as though it had never truly seen the long journeys it claimed. He turned it over again and again, fingers heavy yet delicate, as though weighing not the paper but the story it implied. A man who chose to live beneath another's name was never a man without complications. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning beneath his weight, and drew in the smoke of his pipe. His eyes, weary but steady, travelled once more to the Seine. The city was waking now. A tram bell rang faintly in the distance. Soon the quay would be filled with carriages, bicycles, hurrying clerks. The life of Paris would conceal the man with the false passport, as easily as fog concealed the river's far bank. Yet Maigret could not shake the sensation that the case would not rest, that it would grow into something larger, something heavier than the forged document itself. Janvier had brought the passport to him late the night before, his face flushed with the brisk air outside. The young inspector's enthusiasm always reminded Maigret of his own early years, when each case seemed a path into the very heart of human nature. "It looks real, Chief," Janvier had said, his voice almost eager. "But the stamps, they don't match the records. I checked the border lists for last spring." He had leaned over the desk, pointing to a page where the ink seemed slightly too bold. Maigret had nodded, saying little. He preferred to let silence weigh on an object until it revealed itself. Words, too quickly spoken, had a way of pushing truth back into the shadows. Now, in the quiet of early morning, the passport remained mute, though it seemed to breathe a faint unease into the room. Maigret felt the heaviness in his chest, not of fear, but of anticipation. He had learned over years of investigations that truth rarely presented itself in a blaze of clarity. More often it seeped in slowly through gestures, half-remembered phrases, a glance too hurried, or a silence too deliberate. He wondered about the man in the hospital bed, his features hidden beneath bruises, his real name perhaps forgotten even by himself after years of borrowing others. The corridor outside creaked with the footsteps of a cleaner, her bucket clattering lightly against the wall. Somewhere below, a telephone rang, distant, insistent. Maigret did not move. He let the city enter the building, the murmur of Paris mingling with the weight of the passport. In another hour he would go to the hospital, speak with the man if he was awake. But what would he ask? Who are you? Where do you come from? Questions as old as the police, yet rarely answered with truth. Men carried lies as they carried their coats, out of habit, out of necessity, out of shame. He thought of Madame Maigret, still asleep in their apartment, on the boulevard Richard Lenoir. She would rise soon, prepare the coffee, fold the paper neatly on the table. She never asked much about his work, though her silence was not indifference, but a quiet loyalty. She knew that his cases lived with him even at home, carried in the heaviness of his step, the absent way he stirred his soup. He would tell her only fragments, enough to share the burden without opening the whole. This morning she would notice his fatigue, perhaps urge him to eat more at dinner, perhaps not. Maigret pressed the passport closed and let it rest beneath his palm. Already it seemed heavier than mere paper. It was the kind of case that began with something small, an object almost ordinary, but which carried the seeds of deeper trouble. He recalled other times, a matchbox, a pair of gloves, a scrap of telegram, all leading to men and women whose lives unravelled before his eyes. The passport was such an object, lying deceptively still, waiting for him to follow where it led. By 8 o'clock he was in the hospital, the smell of antiseptic sharp against his nostrils, the corridors filled with nurses in white aprons moving briskly between rooms. The man lay in bed, head bandaged, his skin sallow beneath the bruises. His eyes opened briefly as Maigret entered, then closed again, as though against some unbearable light. A nurse whispered that he would recover, though slowly. The inspector drew up a chair and sat, his heavy frame lowering with a sigh of wood. He watched the man breathe, slow, uneven. On the table beside the bed lay the man's clothes folded neatly by hospital orderlies, a jacket of coarse fabric, trousers patched at the knee, shoes worn at the soles. Nothing in them spoke of foreign travel, of stamps at border crossings, of names inscribed in gold. He waited, patient as always, until the man's eyes fluttered open once more. They were dark, uncertain, like the eyes of a dog that has been struck too often. Maigret did not speak at once. He merely filled his pipe, struck a match, and let the smoke drift upward. When he finally asked the first question, his voice was low, almost conversational. "What is your name?" The man hesitated, lips trembling, then whispered a syllable that might have been true or might have been another layer of the lie. Maigret listened, nodded, and made no correction. It was only the beginning. Names were often the last thing to be trusted. What mattered was the silence after the name, the way the man's eyes darted toward the passport on the chair. That glance told Maigret more than words could. It told him that the man feared the document, feared its discovery, feared above all the truth it might betray. The inspector rose after a few minutes, heavy coat draped over his arm, pipe still smouldering. Outside, the city had grown louder, carts rattling, vendors shouting, the life of Paris surging forward without pause. He walked slowly back toward the Seine, the passport tucked securely in his pocket, its weight pressing against his side like a secret. Already he could sense that the case would not remain confined to a single man in a boarding house. The forgery was too fine, the silence too deep. Somewhere behind it all stood others who preferred to remain unseen. The fog lifted slightly as the sun pushed through, pale and hesitant. Maigret paused on the bridge, watching the water swirl below. The passport that should not have existed had become the key to a story yet untold. He felt the faint shiver of curiosity, the same that had driven him through countless cases before. Behind the forged paper lay a man's life, perhaps several, and with them the labyrinth of Paris itself. He drew in the last of his pipe, exhaled slowly, and turned back toward the Quai des Orfèvres. The hunt, as always, had begun. The grey morning had softened into a listless drizzle by the time Maigret reached the canal. The narrow waterway cut through the quarter like a scar, sluggish and heavy, its surface bruised by raindrops that left endless circles in retreat. Along its banks, warehouses hunched in silence, shutters closed, as though unwilling to admit the damp air. Barges swayed lazily against their moorings, ropes creaking, and the faint smell of coal lingered in the mist. To an untrained passerby it might have seemed an ordinary Paris morning, dreary, monotonous, soaked in grey, but for Maigret every detail breathed the restless pulse of a district that had seen too many hurried footsteps, too many secrets exchanged beneath the yellow glow of lamps. At the corner stood a café with flaking paint, its awning sagging from the rain, its windows steamed with the breath of early patrons. Inside, the warmth struck immediately, a mix of damp wool, tobacco smoke, and the sour tang of wine poured too early in the day. A stove in the corner hissed faintly, its warmth insufficient to drive the chill from the stone floor. The barman, thick-set and unsmiling, polished glasses with a rag that had seen better days, his eyes flicking up as the inspector entered. Conversations, low and murmuring, faltered for a heartbeat before resuming. Everyone recognized a policeman when one crossed the threshold, even if he wore no uniform. Maigret's bulk, the worn overcoat, the damp bowler hat, the pipe clamped firmly in his mouth, all marked him as a man who observed, who remembered, who would not be hurried. He removed his hat, shook the rain from it, and settled at a corner table. The wooden chair creaked beneath his weight. He ordered a calvados with the same calmness he brought into every investigation, not because he needed the drink, but because its presence anchored him, made him part of the landscape. The glass arrived with a thud, amber liquid catching the dim light. He let it sit untouched for a moment, his eyes wandering across the room. There was a card game in progress near the stove, 4 men hunched over a scarred table, their cigarettes dangling precariously, their voices low. A woman in a worn blue coat sat at the bar, her hair pinned back too tightly, her gaze fixed not on her glass, but on the reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. She was young enough to still carry the traces of hope in her face, yet old enough to have them dulled by long nights and the slow erosion of waiting. Near the door, a man with a moustache yellowed by tobacco leaned against the wall, pretending to read a newspaper, though his eyes travelled often toward the inspector. Maigret did not speak at once. He lit his pipe, the flare of the match illuminating the heavy features of his face, and exhaled slowly. Smoke drifted upward, joining the haze that already blurred the air. The cafe's atmosphere thickened around him, voices blurring into a steady hum. He had come not for answers, but for echoes, for the subtle tremors of recognition that always followed when a false name, a forged document, or a man with no past left a trace behind. It was Janvier who had hinted at this place the evening before, his notes full of addresses that meant little on their own, but which to Maigret formed a pattern. The boarding-house near the Rue de la Roquette, the hospital bed where the man lay unconscious, and this café by the canal, 3 points of a triangle that promised a story beneath its geometry. Men who lived under false names did not wander aimlessly. They gravitated to corners where silence could be bought with a drink, where landladies asked no questions, where a barman's eyes could record more than his tongue would ever admit. The woman in the blue coat caught his attention. She shifted slightly on her stool, crossing her legs with an air too deliberate, as if to draw or deflect attention. Her glass remained nearly full, though she had been seated long before Maigret arrived. He noted the tremor of her hand when she adjusted her coat, the quick dart of her eyes toward the door whenever it opened. She was waiting for someone or for something. The inspector drew in another slow breath of his pipe, his gaze steady but not intrusive. People revealed themselves not under interrogation, but under silence. After a time, he called the barman over. The man's shoulders were broad, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hands scarred from years of bottles and knives. Maigret's voice was low, steady, almost conversational. "The man brought to the hospital last night. Did he come here?" The barman hesitated just enough for the question to matter. He glanced toward the card players, toward the woman in the blue coat, and back to Maigret. "Maybe," he muttered, wiping the counter though no spill was there. "A lot of men come. Hard to remember." Maigret nodded, saying nothing more. He had expected no admission, yet the hesitation was enough. The café had seen the man, or someone who carried his shadow. The inspector let the silence fall again, returning to his calvados. He drank it slowly, savouring the warmth as it spread through his chest, though his mind was elsewhere, arranging fragments like pieces of a puzzle. The card game ended abruptly, coins clinking on the table, as 2 men rose, muttering curses at their luck. They brushed past Maigret on their way out, their eyes avoiding his. One smelled strongly of cheap cologne, the other of sweat and coal dust. Neither looked back once they stepped into the drizzle. The woman in the blue coat drained her glass at last, set it down with too much precision, and slid from her stool. For a moment she hesitated, then crossed the room toward Maigret. Her heels clicked softly on the worn floorboards. "Inspector." Her voice was low, carrying both caution and a strange intimacy, as though she had rehearsed the word before daring to speak it. "You're looking for him." Maigret raised his eyes, steady and unreadable. "Am I?" She sat opposite him without invitation, hands folded tightly in her lap. Up close, her face revealed sleepless nights, the faint trace of powder failing to hide the lines of worry. I don't know his name, not the real one, but he comes here, not often, always sits by the window as if waiting for someone to recognize him. Maigret let the silence stretch, watching her struggle against her own words. "Why tell me this?" he asked finally, his tone without accusation. She shifted, her eyes darting toward the barman, then back. "Because someone will kill him, or perhaps already tried." She paused, her lips tightening. "And I don't want to be here when it happens." The inspector studied her carefully. Fear clung to her like a scent, not the kind that comes from sudden danger, but the slow, gnawing dread of one who has lived too long in the shadow of others' secrets. He nodded once, as if to acknowledge her courage in speaking at all. Then, in his slow, deliberate way, he rose, placed a coin on the table, and reached for his hat. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into rain, blurring the outlines of the barges, the warehouses, the narrow bridge that spanned the canal. Maigret pulled his coat tighter around him, the pipe still glowing faintly between his teeth. He did not look back at the café. He had learned long ago that cafés kept their secrets better when not pressed. Yet the woman's words followed him into the rain, mingling with the echo of her fear. Someone would kill the man with the false passport, or perhaps had already tried. He walked slowly along the canal, boots splashing in shallow puddles, the grey water beside him carrying its own silence. Somewhere in this quarter, a man lived under a name not his own, moving from café to boarding house, from shadow to shadow, while others watched with intent too dark to be spoken aloud. The passport in Maigret's pocket grew heavier with each step, as if reminding him that it was more than paper. It was a story of pursuit, of fear, of a lie so carefully constructed that it demanded protection or destruction. By the time he reached the next bridge, the inspector stopped beneath a lamppost and let the rain bead upon his coat. His pipe had gone out, but he did not relight it. The woman's words replayed in his mind, not as evidence, but as atmosphere, shaping the path ahead. The case was no longer a question of forgery. It was a matter of survival, of shadows converging around a single man whose true name had yet to be spoken. The canal stretched ahead, grey and endless, its water reflecting only the pale blur of the sky. Maigret adjusted his hat, squared his shoulders, and turned back toward the city. The hunt was leading him deeper now, and the air grew heavier with each step, as though Paris herself anticipated the next revelation. The day had already leaned into late afternoon when Janvier returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, his overcoat damp at the shoulders, his hair plastered in untidy strands against his forehead. He carried no umbrella. He never did. His notebook, however, was tucked deep inside his pocket, its edges softened by rain, its pages crowded with names, addresses, impressions, scribbled hastily in pencil, before the drizzle could smudge them away. He found Maigret in his office, as always, seated heavily behind the desk, the same passport resting where it had since morning, as if it refused to let itself be forgotten. The inspector's pipe smoke curled slowly toward the ceiling, staining the air with its earthy weight. Janvier dropped into the chair opposite, exhaling like a man who had carried the city's secrets on his shoulders all day. He wiped his brow with his sleeve and gave a half-smile that carried both fatigue and satisfaction. "I've been walking the quarter since dawn. The man's shadow lingers everywhere, Chief, though not one person is willing to admit they've seen him." He tapped his breast pocket. "Still, there are whispers. Rumors. You'll want to hear them." Maigret gestured with his pipe for him to begin. He never hurried his men, never demanded more than what they could recall at their own pace. Truth emerged not from pressure, but from patience. "The boarding house on Rue de la Roquette," Janvier said, opening the notebook. "The landlord swore he'd never seen the fellow before last night. Yet a washerwoman who lives 2 floors below claims she's heard footsteps on the stairs at hours when no tenant was meant to come or go. Heavy footsteps, as though the man carried something in his pockets, or perhaps carried himself with caution." He squinted at his own notes. "She said she smelled tobacco she didn't recognize, strong, foreign. Something harsher than Gauloise's." Maigret nodded slowly. He thought of the unconscious man in the hospital, the bruises that had erased his features, the muttered name that may or may not have been true. A smoker always betrayed himself, if not by his clothes, then by the memory of those who crossed his path. Janvier continued, his voice steady. "At the markets near Bastille, a fruit seller told me he'd seen a man matching the description weeks ago, buying apples and paying with coins that gleamed too brightly, as if newly minted. He said the man spoke little, kept his collar up, but his accent, something about it wasn't Parisian. He thought perhaps Belgian, perhaps farther east. He couldn't be sure." The inspector leaned back, pipe glowing faintly. "An accent, coins too new, tobacco too harsh." Each detail was a thread, and Maigret had learned never to dismiss threads, no matter how fragile. He let the silence fall, watching Janvier shift in his chair, eager to go on. "The cafes along the canal are worse," Janvier said at last. "Everyone pretends ignorance, but I saw the barman's face when I asked about strangers. He gave me the kind of look men give when they know more than they wish to admit. And there was a woman, young, wearing blue, who slipped out before I could follow. The patrons avoid the subject, but their eyes, they've seen him. Or someone close enough." Maigret's eyes narrowed, though not in suspicion of his subordinate. The woman again, the one he had seen that very morning. The same blue presence, as though the colour itself had taken root in the case. He said nothing of her yet. He preferred to let Janvier finish unspooling his observations. The young inspector thumbed through the notebook, his voice lowering. "The train stations too, Chief. I spoke with a porter at the Gare de l'Est. He recalled a man with a heavy suitcase who arrived late at night, a month ago perhaps." He remembered because the suitcase was worn, patched in leather, but carried with the care of something precious. The man asked no directions, spoke to no one, and yet walked straight toward the street as if he had been expected. The porter thought it odd, but then again, people come and go every night. He would have forgotten entirely if not for the description. Maigret allowed himself a faint exhale. A suitcase, guarded carefully, carried with intent. He pictured it resting beneath a bed in some dim lodging, holding the truth more tightly than the passport itself. He wondered if it still existed, if it had been spirited away by cautious hands the moment the man fell in that boarding-house quarrel. Janvier closed the notebook with a snap. "That's what I have, nothing certain. A handful of shadows." He looked almost apologetic, but Maigret shook his head slowly. "Shadows are enough," he murmured, his voice deep, measured. "They fall only where something stands to block the light." The young man sat back, reassured. He had worked under Maigret long enough to know that the inspector valued these fragments more than any bold statement. Truth was not delivered whole, but pieced together from such whispers, the way a mosaic emerges from broken stones. The office grew quiet, the only sound the creak of the river against its embankments beyond the window. Maigret tamped down the ash in his pipe, refilled it, and struck another match. The flame lit his face briefly, revealing the furrows carved deep by years of patience, by nights spent listening to the lies of men and the silences of women. He thought of the accent described, of the coins too new, of the unseen suitcase. He thought of the woman in blue speaking in that smoky cafe with her voice caught between fear and warning. "Did you notice anything else?" Maigret asked finally, his voice more a rumble than a question. Janvier hesitated. "Only that people seemed relieved when I left, as though they feared being seen even speaking to me, as though the man's shadow frightened them more than the police." That was what Maigret had suspected. Fear that clung not to the man himself, but to what he represented. A forgery so perfect, a silence so thick, a presence that could unsettle a whole quarter. It meant others stood behind him, watching, perhaps guiding. Men did not live so carefully under borrowed names unless someone paid dearly for them to vanish. The inspector rose from his chair, pipe in hand, and crossed to the window. The Seine moved sluggishly below, reflecting the fading light of the afternoon. He stood there for a long while, Janvier silent behind him, until at last he turned. "You did well," Maigret said simply. "Better than you think. Go home, eat, sleep. Tomorrow you'll walk again. The city speaks slowly. It repeats itself, and then we listen." Janvier nodded, weary but proud. He stood, buttoned his coat, and left with the quiet tread of a man who respected silence as much as his superior did. The door closed gently behind him. Alone again, Maigret returned to his desk. The passport still lay where it had in the morning, its cover dull in the dimming light. He opened it once more, flipping through the pages, each stamp like a false memory imposed upon the paper. A man who might be Belgian, or perhaps from farther east. Tobacco too harsh for Paris, coins too new for the markets, a suitcase carried with reverence, a woman in blue whose fear smelled of inevitability. The office grew darker as evening fell. Somewhere across the river, a church bell struck 6. Maigret filled his pipe again, leaned back heavily, and let the shadows of Paris settle into the room. The report from the streets was not merely a collection of rumours. It was the first outline of a figure who had yet to show his true face. And behind him, perhaps, a chain of others, men whose names would never appear on paper, yet whose influence stretched across borders and boulevards alike. The inspector exhaled smoke that mingled with the dusk, his eyes heavy but alert. The passport had begun to speak, not in words, but in the murmurs of a city unwilling to forget the presence of a stranger. And Maigret, patient as ever, prepared himself to follow those murmurs wherever they might lead, even if they led beyond the reach of official reports. The evening had closed its fist around Paris, pulling a damp wind along the narrow streets of Montmartre. The lamps glowed faintly through the mist, their halos soft as if wrapped in gauze, and shutters clattered nervously against the walls when the gusts pressed too hard. Maigret climbed slowly up the incline, his pipe clenched between his teeth, his heavy coat pulled close against the chill. He had followed no explicit trail. Rather, it was the kind of instinct that came from years of listening to the city breathe. The woman in the café by the canal had not vanished into memory. Her blue coat, her taut smile, her words spoken as if each syllable had cost her dearly. These had lingered, and now they drew him like a faint scent in the fog. Montmartre carried its own particular silence, not the emptiness of deserted alleys, but a hum muffled by music behind closed doors, by laughter that never reached the street, by the muted rhythm of feet climbing stairs toward rented rooms. The quarter had grown more theatrical than it once had been, its bohemia now a parody. Yet behind the painted facades, life remained as fragile as ever. Seamstresses in dim rooms, Cabaret singers who swallowed their exhaustion with cheap wine, men who drifted from one corner to another, their shoulders bent as though carrying invisible burdens. It was at the corner of a small square where a bakery had closed for the night, and only the scent of bread lingered in the air, that Maigret saw her again. She stood beneath a lamp whose light trembled in the wind, her dress the same blue he remembered, though now without the coat. She looked smaller, more exposed. Her arms folded against the chill, she seemed less like a conspirator and more like a woman lost in her own indecision. When she noticed him, her lips parted, not in surprise but in resignation, as though she had expected him all along. She did not move as he approached, his footsteps steady on the stones, his shadow stretching ahead of him in the lamplight. "You followed," she said softly, her voice almost carried away by the wind. Maigret shook his head. "No, I found you. There's a difference." For a moment her eyes searched his, uncertain whether to believe. Then she gave a faint smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You want to know about him? Everyone does, but no one says his name." The inspector drew his pipe from his mouth and tapped it gently against his palm. "What name should they say?" She hesitated. The wind pressed the folds of her dress against her legs, revealing the trembling of her body beneath. "He gave me one once. It may not have been his. It sounded foreign, but soft. Like the name of a man who wanted to be, trusted. I kept it to myself. I knew not to repeat it." She lowered her gaze, her hands tightening around her arms. "When he sat with me, he spoke little. He always watched the door." Maigret studied her in silence. He had learned long ago that women often carried the heart of a case, not in facts but in impressions, in the fragments men left behind without meaning to. Her words held the rhythm of truth, not because they were precise, but because they revealed what mattered to her, the waiting, the watching, the silence at a table shared. "Did he tell you why he was here?" Maigret asked gently. She shook her head. "He never said. But once, late, after too much wine, he spoke of borders, not as lines on a map, but as wounds that never close. He said papers were stronger than flesh, that a stamp could give or take a life." Then he stopped, as if afraid of his own words. The inspector drew in the damp air, the scent of bread still faint behind them, the sound of a piano drifting from a nearby cabaret. Papers stronger than flesh, a phrase too heavy for chance. It echoed the passport on his desk, the document that had opened this story like a wound itself. The woman raised her eyes again, and for the first time there was anger behind them, sharp as broken glass. "You think I helped him?" "Perhaps I did. I brought him here once, to Montmartre. He wanted to see the lights, the laughter, as if he belonged, but he never belonged. He sat in the corner, hands around his glass, and I could feel him listening for footsteps that never came. I don't know what he feared more, that someone would find him, or that no one ever would." Maigret let her words hang in the air. He thought of the unconscious man in the hospital, his battered face, his silence. Fear lingered in him still, though his body was too weak to show it. Perhaps he had carried it across borders, hidden in his suitcase, folded into the very passport that now lay in Maigret's possession. "Why tell me this?" the inspector asked at last. "Why not remain silent, like the others?" Her face softened, though her lips trembled. "Because silence kills as surely as a bullet. And I am tired of silence." For a moment the inspector felt the weight of her words, not as evidence but as confession. She was not merely speaking of the man, but of herself, of the years spent in cafes where men spoke in half-truths, where women waited for promises that dissolved with dawn. He saw in her not just a witness, but a soul frayed by proximity to danger. The wind carried a burst of laughter from the cabaret nearby, followed by the clatter of glasses. The sound jarred against the quiet tension of their exchange. Maigret replaced his pipe between his teeth, struck a match, and let the flame illuminate his features briefly before the smoke reclaimed them. "You'll see him again," he said quietly. She looked startled, then wary. "How can you know?" "Because men who run from their names always return to the women who once said them aloud, even if only for a moment." Her eyes glistened in the lamplight, though she blinked away whatever emotion threatened to surface. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the shadows of the square. "If you find him, Inspector, be kind. He is guilty of many things, perhaps, but I don't believe cruelty is one of them." Maigret gave a slow nod. He knew the line well. Men guilty of lies, of theft, of vanishing acts, yet whose eyes revealed not malice but despair. Whether the man with the false passport belonged to that breed or another, time would tell. For now, the inspector let her words settle, part truth, part plea. When she left, her figure faded quickly into the mist, the blue of her dress swallowed by shadows. Maigret remained beneath the lamp for a time, listening to the hum of Montmartre, to the music carried on damp air, to the endless rhythm of footsteps on stairs. His pipe smoke mingled with the fog, dissipating into nothingness. He turned at last, descending slowly toward the wider streets below. Each step carried with it the certainty that the woman in blue was not the end of the thread, but its continuation. She had given him no name, no address, no certainty. Yet she had given him something rarer, the pulse of fear and longing that trailed behind the man with the false passport. It was enough to move forward. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, long past midnight, Maigret dropped heavily into his chair, the passport waiting like a silent conspirator. He placed it before him, its cover dull in the lamplight, and thought of her words. Papers stronger than flesh. Silence as deadly as bullets. A man who feared both discovery and oblivion. The inspector refilled his pipe, the scratch of the match echoing in the quiet office. The night pressed against the windows, but Maigret did not feel alone. Paris itself seemed to watch with him, its fog, its streets, its cafes, all complicit in the secret of the man whose name had yet to be spoken. And somewhere in the city, perhaps even now, that man moved again, carrying his borrowed identity like a shield already cracking. The Gare du Nord at night carried its own peculiar kind of silence, one that was never complete, yet always heavy. The echoes of the day still clung to its iron arches and tiled corridors, though the great rush of footsteps and voices had ebbed away with the last departures toward Lille and Brussels. Only the stragglers remained, porters half asleep on benches, women with tired children clinging to their skirts, travellers who stared too long at the boards as if they might reveal something other than timetables. The lamps above burned a pale yellow, casting weary halos on the floor, and outside the drizzle blurred the lamps of waiting carriages into trembling smears of light. Maigret had chosen the station as one chooses a vantage point on a battlefield. The man with the false passport was not to be found in cafes alone, nor in lodging houses whose walls could forget a tenant in a week. No, such a man must sooner or later gravitate toward the great arteries of the city, where movement was constant and anonymity easy to purchase. A forged document gained meaning only at borders, at ticket counters, at gates where uniformed men asked questions that demanded paper answers. If he had travelled before, he would return again, and perhaps the Gare du Nord would reveal him. The inspector settled into the shadows near the ticket hall, his bulk hidden beneath the folds of his heavy coat, his bowler hat tilted low, his pipe smouldering faintly. He had the patience of a fisherman able to watch the same pool of water for hours without complaint. His eyes moved slowly, never hurried, taking in gestures rather than faces. The hurried flick of a glance toward a clock, the cautious way a suitcase was shifted from one hand to another, the brief hesitation before approaching the counter. These told more than any hurried interrogation could. The hours passed. Midnight came, and the great clock under the glass roof struck 12 with a hollow note that echoed through the iron rafters. Few trains left after that, only the slow, rattling night lines carrying workers back to suburbs or travellers farther north. Maigret did not stir. He felt the ache in his back, the stiffness in his legs, but his mind remained clear, focused. He had spent nights like this before, at ports, in narrow alleys, in shabby hotels, watching, waiting for a single face among hundreds. Always, eventually, a pattern broke, and the lie revealed itself. Near 1 o'clock a figure drew his attention. A man in a long dark coat entered from the Rue de Dunkerque side, his collar turned up, a hat pulled low against the drizzle. He carried a suitcase of medium size, worn but carefully kept, leather straps darkened from years of use. He walked with purpose, yet each step seemed weighed with hesitation, as if he rehearsed his movements while performing them. His eyes darted toward the ticket windows, then away, toward the departures board, then down again. He did not approach at once. Instead, he moved toward a bench, set the suitcase beside him, and lit a cigarette with fingers that trembled more than the cold could explain. Maigret watched through the haze of his pipe smoke. The man's profile, blurred in the dim light, was not one he recognized from the hospital bed. The bruises there had made certainty impossible, but the unease, the way he seemed to fold into himself, was familiar. The inspector leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze steady yet impersonal. He knew better than to pounce. A frightened man bolted like a rabbit. A cautious man exposed himself when left in silence. The man smoked quickly, each drag deep, almost desperate, as though to steady his nerves. Then at last he rose, retrieved his suitcase and approached the counter. The clerk behind the glass looked up, bored, his hand poised with a pen. The man spoke in low tones, slid coins across, received a ticket with a perfunctory nod. He did not linger. Ticket in one hand, suitcase in the other, he walked toward the platform gates. Maigret rose now, slowly, carefully. He did not follow at once, but gave distance, as though he, too, were an ordinary traveller. His heavy steps made little sound on the worn tiles. At the gate, the man presented his ticket, then paused when asked for his papers. It was a small pause, barely a heartbeat, yet to Maigret it rang louder than any confession. The man produced the passport, handed it over with fingers that tightened as the clerk inspected it. The official flipped through the pages, nodded, and stamped the ticket. The man exhaled, almost visibly, before reclaiming both. The inspector lit his pipe again as he watched, the flare of the match briefly lighting his face. He noted the suitcase, the careful grip, the faint sag of the man's shoulders after the exchange. Every gesture spoke of someone carrying not luggage, but a life, borrowed and fragile. When the man disappeared down the platform, Maigret followed at a measured pace. The train waiting there hissed impatiently, its windows glowing faintly in the damp night. Passengers shuffled aboard, few in number, their movements sluggish with fatigue. The man with the suitcase chose a compartment near the end, slid inside and set the case beside him on the seat. He did not remove his coat or hat. He sat stiffly staring at the blurred reflections in the glass. Maigret did not enter the same carriage. Instead, he paused beneath the awning, smoke curling from his pipe, his eyes narrowing as he considered. He could step in now, reveal himself, demand answers. Yet something, in the man's posture, told him the time was not ripe. An interrogation now would yield little but lies. Better to let him travel, to see where the false passport carried him, to discover whether he sought refuge or rendezvous. The whistle shrieked, long and mournful. The inspector remained where he was as the train shuddered into motion, its wheels clattering on the tracks, sparks flying faintly in the damp night. He watched until the red lantern at its rear disappeared into darkness. Only then did he turn, his broad shoulders rolling beneath the weight of his coat. The Gare du Nord returned to silence. A porter swept lazily near the benches, indifferent to the inspector's presence. Maigret moved toward the exit, his pipe extinguished now, his face unreadable. He did not feel defeat. Patience was his weapon, more reliable than force. The man had revealed himself, not fully, but enough. The suitcase, the pause at the gate, the way fear clung to him like damp to cloth. These were the cracks in the armor of anonymity. Outside, the drizzle had ceased, leaving the cobblestones slick, reflecting the lamps in watery patterns. A cab waited, its horse stamping restlessly. Maigret ignored it. He preferred the walk, the slow rhythm of his boots against the stones, the night air cooling his thought. The Seine lay not far, dark and silent, its current tugging steadily toward unseen places. He thought of the train rushing into the night, carrying the man with the passport farther from Paris, yet never truly away from it. For Paris held on to its secrets, and sooner or later they circled back. As the inspector reached the boulevard, he paused beneath a lamp, refilled his pipe, and struck a match. The flame flared, then steadied. He drew in smoke, let it drift upward into the mist, and exhaled slowly. Somewhere, perhaps already, the man with the suitcase sat staring into the darkness outside his window, feeling both escape and pursuit pressing against him. And Maigret, steady as the river, would be waiting when the circle closed. The night watch at the Gare du Nord had not ended in arrest or revelation, but it had marked a turning. The lie in the passport had walked openly through the gates, carried onto a train, witnessed by the inspector's calm eyes. The city had spoken again, in whispers of iron wheels and stamped tickets, and Maigret knew the hunt was tightening, its silence louder now than any confession. Morning broke without warmth, a pale light flattening the facades along the boulevard, as if Paris herself had pressed her cheek against the window panes to look in. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors smelled of wet wool and old paper, and footsteps dragged rather than rang. Lucas arrived with a steadiness that belonged to him alone, his hat dry, despite the mist outside, his jaw set in that way that suggested he had decided something during the night and would not unmake it. He was the sort of man who never hurried and never seemed to need to, whose patience resembled Maigret's but carried a sharper edge, as if cut to fit tighter spaces. He stepped into the inspector's office, closed the door without sound, and stood before the desk with a look that said he would speak when spoken to, but had already begun his work hours ago. Maigret lifted his eyes from the cold pipe between his fingers and waited, the quiet behind them growing deliberate. Lucas reached into his coat and set down a brass key that bore no number on its oval tag, only the scratches of years and a faint stain of oil from hands that had never been careful. "There is a house," Lucas said at last, his voice the dry scrape of an old hinge used infrequently. "On the Rue des Trois Bornes, the sort that rents by the week to men who pay in advance and ask for nothing but a bed and a bolt, The landlady says she has no rooms. She has 3. One opens and closes without ever appearing in her ledger. He gestured with 2 fingers at the key. This was left in a pocket of a coat taken to the pawn shop on the corner. The pawnbroker was obliging when I told him whose coat it had been. Maigret turned the key in his palm, feeling its weight. Keys carried the temperature of their owners, that faint warmth of use that lingered longer than one would think. This one was cold, as if it had sat in a drawer or behind a clock for weeks. He watched Lucas without comment, and the other man went on, more softly now, as if the words themselves might activate some hidden mechanism in the morning air. The landlady is a widow from Saint-Quentin with a voice like a kettle left to boil dry. She counts coins by sound rather than number. When I asked about vacancies, she said her tenants were quiet men with early errands. She was slicing bread. A woman came down the stairs while we spoke, blue dress, thin belt, no coat. She kept her eyes on the floor and stepped past as if she were accustomed to being air. The landlady said nothing to her, and the woman said nothing to us. I don't think she lives there. She moves like someone who hopes not to be remembered. The blue dress threaded through the room like a stitch drawn taut. Maigret set the key on the desk and rubbed his thumb across the metal until it left a faint grey line on his skin. He remembered the woman's face beneath the Montmartre lamp, the quiet echo of her plea. If she had passed through that house, her silence would have become part of its brickwork. He rose, the chair's legs stuttering on the floorboards, and fetched his coat from its hook. Lucas did not ask whether they would go at once. They both knew there are mornings that require the body to move before reason has finished its arguments. The Rue des Trois Bornes lay folded into itself, a short, unsmiling street where laundry hung even on grey days, because habit held stronger than weather. The houses leaned together, sharing secrets along the gutter, their doors painted the same brown that looked like dried coffee. A cart filled with split wood had left damp tracks on the cobbles. A boy with a scabbed lip kicked a tin and stopped when he saw the 2 men. Policemen, even without badges, remove sound from streets like this. The lodging house kept a bell that did not ring cleanly, but coughed when Lucas pulled it. The landlady gave them a face that had forgotten how to be surprised and held the door open as one holds open a mouth to show missing teeth. "We've no rooms," she said, already moving back toward her desk, which was a table grafted onto a staircase. "We've only quiet men and a rule against questions." Maigret took off his hat and shook the damp from the brim. "We've not come to ask questions," he said, and then, after a small pause, "only to look." He had found over the years that the distinction meant something to those who rented rooms without names. Looking could be indulged, while questions implied a ledger that might one day be read aloud. The hallway smelled of kerosene and boiled cabbage, and the walls wore the polish of many shoulders. Doors lined one side, each with a number painted in a hand too careful for such a place. The odd thing was not the doors themselves, but the spaces between them, which did not seem to line up with the bends in the corridor. Some houses carry their lies in the cellar. This one wore its falsehood right along the plaster. Lucas let his fingers trail lightly along the wall until they found a ridge no paintbrush had intended. He did not look at the landlady when he asked, very politely, for a rag. She handed one over with a sigh that might have been a warning or a prayer. Lucas rubbed at the ridge, and the lustre of wax knuckled into dullness. Then he pressed his palm flat, and the wall made the sound that only wood makes when it remembers being a door. The landlady's mouth drew into a seam. "That is for mops," she said, as if the words themselves could reconstruct the corridor. "For mops," Lucas agreed, and slid the key into a slot that was not a keyhole until it became one. The turn was resistant, then willing. The door opened onto a narrow room whose air had not been stirred since the last man left it. There is a smell that belongs to rooms made for disappearance, wool that has absorbed more nights than days, the iron tang of coins counted in the dark, a skin of dust so fine it collects on breath. Maigret stepped inside and did not speak. He never spoke first to such rooms. He let them arrange themselves around him until they chose the place where the story would sit. The bed stood against the wall with a blanket folded at the foot, its crease exact. A small table held a lamp whose shade was stained the color of nicotine, and a chipped saucer filled with the grey stubs of cigarettes rolled by a careful hand. A cracked mirror watched from above a washstand. In the corner, an iron stove sulked with its mouth closed. The window had been papered from within with sheets of newsprint that kept out more than cold. On the floor, just beneath the bed, the wood had been burnished, not by shoes, but by a box, dragged in and out many times with the same cautious rhythm. Lucas crouched first. He lifted the blanket, reached, and slid forth a suitcase whose leather had been rubbed smooth by years of palms and the edges of train platforms. Its twin, or near enough, had passed under Maigret's eyes the night before at the Gare du Nord. The straps here were newer than the body, the buckles old, the handle wrapped with twine that had been replaced more than once. Lucas set it on the bed, and for a long moment neither man moved. Even the landlady, who had not stepped across the threshold, seemed to hold her breath in the corridor, and the house quieted as if listening to itself. "Open it," Maigret said, and the words seemed to slow the room's heartbeat rather than quicken it. Lucas worked the buckles with that same unfussy patience that made him valuable in apartments where panic lay under the carpets. The lid lifted on air that smelled faintly of camphor and damp border stations. On top lay a shirt folded with military neatness, then another, a razor wrapped in a square of linen, a pair of socks rolled into a ball like a swallowed secret. Beneath these, beneath the ordinary decoys of a traveller who wanted to be plausible, lay packets of paper bound with black thread. They were not bundles of banknotes, as a vulgar mind might have hoped, but documents, letters in 2 or 3 hands, the thin onion skin of carbon copies, a sheaf of passport photographs that showed the same face with changes so minor, hair parted left, hair parted right, a moustache added, the chin darkened with pencil, that one could not help but think of a man trying to convince the mirror to be someone else. Maigret did not reach for the papers. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched them accumulate on the blanket as Lucas lifted them out and laid them in order. There were stamps from embassies that had been closed and reopened, forms printed in languages that had shared borders with each other more than once in a single decade, and notes in pencil where someone had mocked up a name and then crossed it out for a better one, like a schoolboy testing titles for a composition. In one envelope, brittle with age, there was a card from a photographer on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis with an appointment time smudged by a thumb. Tucked inside the card was a thin, almost weightless strip of negatives that bore the ghost of the same face in 3 poses. In another envelope lay a small tobacco pouch, empty now, but still fierce with the smell of a foreign leaf that scratched at the nose. Janvier's washerwoman would have recognized it. Lucas found the false passport under everything else, as if the man had learned to bury his most important lie beneath the harmless ones. It was not the same document that lay on Maigret's desk. This one wore a different crest, a different alphabet, yet the paper had the same too-clean whiteness, the same careful fatigue applied to its corners, the same stitched thread along its spine. Someone had made it with hands that understood both craft and consequence. The landlady, perhaps to insist upon her authority, coughed into her fist. "I rent to quiet men," she said again, "and I sweep on Sundays." It was an explanation and a defense, and it told Maigret all he needed to know about her complicity, the kind that expects no gratitude and demands no share. She would not admit she'd seen the man, and in a way she had not. She had watched the door open and close and had stared past the space it left. "Who paid last?" Lucas asked without turning. "I don't keep a ledger," she said, and then, after a breath, "Not for him." Maigret stepped to the window and lifted a corner of the newspaper. The glass wore the sweat of the room, and beyond it the courtyard collected echoes in a puddle near the drain. A cat, damp and indifferent, stepped across the stones with its back lifted against the chill. On the paper itself an old headline spoke of a border incident that had come and gone a year ago, and beneath it, photograph of men in coats looking toward a line on a map someone had drawn long before they were born. Papers stronger than flesh, the woman had said. Here, flesh had arranged itself around paper until the two could no longer be told apart. He turned back to the suitcase. "He slept here the night before he was found," Maigret said, not as a conclusion, but as a feeling that belonged to the room, the same way a bed remembers the weight upon it. The ash in the saucer marked a last cigarette that had burned down while a man sat perhaps with his elbows on his knees, listening for footsteps on the stairs. The newsprint on the window had been replaced recently, its edges sharp, where the paste had dried. Somewhere in the house a floorboard cracked, and then the sound of the boy's tin skittered again in the street, and a woman's voice called a name that was not answered. Lucas reassembled the suitcase with the same care he had used to open it. Each paper returned to its layer, the lid lowered, the buckles tightened. He set the key beside it. "If we leave it," he said, "it will draw him back." "It will," Maigret answered, "if he thinks the room still belongs to him." He looked at the landlady. "If he comes, you will say nothing. Not yes, not no. You will let the stairs speak." She nodded, not out of duty, but because something in her had already decided on silence years ago. She would not betray a tenant to the police, but neither would she hide him from the gravity of consequence. Her complicity was, like her bread, cut in equal slices. On the threshold, Maigret paused and let his eyes move once more across the room. The mirror reflected nothing but a dim oval. The lamp waited for its match. The stove held its breath. It was a room built to contain a man who had chosen to become a smudge along a corridor, a notch in a key, a name that did not fit his mouth. He felt the old tug, the mixture of pity and professional steadiness that made him set his shoulders when the case began to show its bones. Somewhere, a train from the north would return tonight, and perhaps a man would step down with the careful weight of one who had travelled on a borrowed ticket. If he had breath left, he would come here. Objects pull their owners back the way the river edges pull flotsam to the quay. The suitcase would wait. The key would keep its shape. The room with no name would hold its breath a little longer. Outside, the air had grown colder, the day thinning toward evening, though the clocks denied it. Lucas walked a half-step behind, his hands deep in his pockets, his eyes on the gutter, as if following a current. "We could watch," he said. "We could watch until he returns." "We will watch," Maigret replied, and his voice was steady, almost gentle. "But not with our eyes only." He meant the quarter, the café by the canal, the woman who tried to be air. He meant the pawnbroker who handled coats with reverence, the porter at the station who remembered a suitcase because it had been carried like a prayer. Paris itself would watch, and it would tell them when the man's shadow thickened enough to be grasped. They did not look back at the house as they left. It had already withdrawn its facades into the anonymity of the street. The boy with the tin resumed his game. A woman shook a rug from a window, and dust fell like grey snow. Somewhere a kettle began to whistle. The city gathered itself for the evening, and within it a single man's lie breathed in time with every other truth. Paris always spoke most loudly in the hours before nightfall, when the boulevards swelled with footsteps and the gas lamps began their glow. The rain of the previous days had dried into a faint gloss on the cobbles, and the trees, still bare in late season, rattled softly in the wind like bones clicking together. Newsboys darted between carriages waving sheets of the evening press, their voices rising in a chorus of half-heard headlines. It was here, on the wide sweep of the Boulevard Saint-Denis, that rumour lived more vividly than fact. Each word spun from lips already quickened by absinthe, each phrase adopted and reshaped before it could reach the ears of the police. Maigret walked with his heavy, deliberate tread, his bowler low, his pipe a steady ember. He did not push himself into the crowds, but let them flow around him, as if the city itself might choose which pieces of conversation drifted into his orbit. For decades he had trusted this instinct more than any official communiqué. Reports came stamped and folded in envelopes, signed in blue ink, and yet it was here, among the murmurs of shopkeepers and the whispers of waiters leaning across zinc counters, that truth showed its shadow. He paused outside a café, the kind whose mirrors multiplied both the customers and their secrets, and took a table at the edge of the terrace. The waiter knew him without needing to ask, bringing him a glass of beer that sweated in the fading light. Maigret sipped slowly, eyes half-lidded, ears open. At the next table, two clerks argued about a man whose arrest had been hushed up, insisting he was no common thief, but something more delicate, more dangerous. Beyond them, a pair of women with feathered hats whispered of foreigners seen near the ministries, their accents strange, their papers immaculate. Someone had paid dearly, they claimed, for such perfection. The inspector let these fragments wash over him, never writing them down, never betraying with a glance that he listened. Rumour was a tide. One had to float in it long enough before recognizing which current carried weight. The man with the false passport had become more than a solitary presence in a lodging house or a silhouette beneath station lamps. He had become a subject for the city's appetite. His shadow grew with each repetition. No one spoke his name, none of them could, but everyone had an image of him, tall or short, young or prematurely old, noble or criminal, depending on who recounted the tale. The barman inside, polishing his glasses as he did every night, leaned subtly against the counter to catch the inspector's attention. Maigret rose, beer unfinished, and entered. The smell of stale tobacco clung to the mirrors, and the piano in the back thudded out a tune as lifeless as the pianist's expression. The barman spoke in a voice meant for no one else. "They say," he murmured, "that the passport is only one of many, a new one for each train. Men like that do not come alone. They're paid to vanish and paid to appear. You won't find him in a file, Inspector, but look near the boulevard, always near the boulevard. That's where the money flows." Maigret studied him through the smoke of his pipe, offering only a nod in return. He did not press further. The barman had given what he could, and to push harder would only silence him. He returned to the terrace, but the boulevard had already shifted, new faces arriving, new voices joining the chorus. He paid for his drink and resumed his walk. The boulevard widened, alive with lights now, the glow reflecting in puddles that had yet to vanish. From a kiosk, a vendor shouted the latest edition of Le Petit Parisien, its front page heavy with politics, but beneath it lurked a small column about counterfeit documents seized at the border. The article spoke vaguely of foreign agents, of names too grand to be printed, of whispers within the prefecture. Maigret bought a copy, folded it without reading further, and slid it into his coat pocket. Newspapers were not truth, they were mirrors of the city's nervousness. He drifted farther, past the arcades where shop windows glittered, past cafes where laughter grew brittle as the night deepened. He listened, always listening. Each snippet seemed to circle the same center. The man who carried papers that were too perfect, too practiced. Some said he had been seen with politicians, others with prostitutes. One rumor placed him in the back room of a bank, another at the railings of the Palais de Justice. The contradictions mattered less than the persistence. The city had chosen its obsession, and Maigret knew from experience that obsessions pointed, eventually, to a kernel of fact. At the corner of Boulevard Bonne Nouvelle, he stopped again, leaning against the railing of a kiosk while his eyes scanned the gathering dusk. A group of students argued fiercely, their hands slashing the air. He caught only fragments. A false name. The North. Money from across the frontier. Behind them, an old veteran sat on a bench, his medals dull against his chest, muttering to anyone who cared that borders were nothing but wounds that men reopened each time they changed their uniforms. Maigret felt the threads knot within him. Rumor had swollen the man with the false passport into something larger than himself. A symbol, a phantom, a vessel for every fear and suspicion the city carried. Yet at the heart of it remained a man, flesh and bone, who smoked foreign tobacco and carried a suitcase with care. If he had become the subject of boulevard gossip, then his trail was not cold. It was heating, dangerously so. The inspector struck a match, cupped it against the wind, and relit his pipe. The glow illuminated his heavy features for a moment before the smoke reclaimed them. He turned slowly back toward the Seine, his boots measured on the cobbles. The boulevard continued to hum behind him, its voices rising like a tide that could drown a man in stories before a single truth reached the surface. Yet Maigret walked steadily, carrying the weight of rumor with the same patience he carried his years. Somewhere within the fabric of gossip lay the seam he would pull, the thread that would unravel the lie into something tangible. For now he let Paris speak, its boulevards alive with shadows. He had learned long ago that rumor was not an obstacle. It was a path, winding and treacherous, but a path all the same. The Seine waited, dark and silent, ready to carry whatever names the night would not speak. The next morning, Paris wore a face of tired grey, the sort of sky that pressed down on roofs and made chimneys smoke with reluctance. Maigret crossed the Pont Neuf with his coat buttoned high, his pipe unlit, for even the act of striking a match seemed too sharp for a day that carried memories like bruises. The rumours of the boulevards had not left him. They clung to his thoughts, like the damp mist to his collar. Names without bodies, whispers without sources, and always the same refrain. The man with the false passport was not merely a vagrant or a petty criminal, but something older, something born from histories the city preferred to leave unspoken. He found himself drawn to a café near Les Invalides, not for the comfort of its zinc counter, but because of the men who gathered there. They were older, shoulders rounded, hands knotted from holding rifles long ago. They sat with their wine glasses before them as if they were medals, staring not at each other but into the haze of smoke, into the spaces where the past played itself again and again. Maigret knew their kind well, veterans of the last war, men whose silence was thicker than their words, men who carried maps in their heads rather than pockets. He took a stool at the end, ordered nothing, and simply listened. One of them, a man with a drooping moustache yellowed by tobacco, muttered about borders that had shifted like drunken men. Another spat into the sawdust and said that papers were more dangerous than rifles, for a rifle only killed once, but papers could erase a man's life forever. Maigret tamped his empty pipe, hearing the echo of the woman in the blue dress. Papers stronger than flesh. When he finally ordered a glass of wine, the barman leaned close, recognizing the inspector without naming him. "You're not the first to ask, you know," he whispered. "Others have come, listening for the same man. They don't wear uniforms, but they smell of offices, of ministries. They want to know who he is, where he hides. They don't ask loudly, but their coins speak." Maigret sipped slowly, his face unreadable. Coins too bright, Janvier had said. Coins that drew attention even at market stalls. Money flowed here, not in rivers, but in thin streams that seeped under doors and into pockets, always tied to the same man, the one who wore faces like coats and crossed borders as though they were lines in sand. Later that afternoon, Maigret walked the narrow streets near Gare de l'Est, where the scars of war still showed. Walls pocked with bullet holes had been plastered over but not forgotten. He passed a doorway where an old woman sat peeling potatoes, her eyes as sharp as the knife in her hand. She looked at him once, then down again, and muttered to no one in particular. They never stopped coming, first in uniforms, then with papers, always men without homes. He stopped, but did not ask her to repeat herself. The truth was in her tone, not her words. By evening, he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, his desk as cluttered as ever, but his thoughts arranged with a new clarity. The false passport was no longer merely an object. It was the symptom of an old wound, a war that had ended on paper but not in hearts. The man in the hospital bed, the woman in blue, the suitcase hidden in the room without a name, all of them were fragments of a story that reached back to trenches, to armistice, to borders rewritten by tired hands. He opened the suitcase once more, the documents laid out like the remnants of a life dissected. Among them he found a letter written in careful French, but with the stiffness of a foreign tongue. It spoke of a town whose name had shifted between nations twice in a generation. It spoke of a brother lost in the confusion, of property seized by whichever army held the street that month, of a promise that someday papers would restore what bullets had taken. Maigret read it twice, his heavy brows furrowing. The letter was unsigned, but the desperation in its lines was unmistakable. Lucas entered quietly, hat in hand, his face drawn from a day spent in rooms too dark for the hour. "They're saying now," he muttered, "that our man once wore a uniform. Some claim he deserted. Others that he was taken prisoner and never came back with the same name. No one agrees, but they all nod when you mention the war." Maigret closed the letter, sliding it back into its envelope. "Men are never the same after war," he said softly. "Some return with medals, some with silence, and some with lies so well woven they believe them themselves." They stood in silence a long while, the inspector staring out the window where the lamps along the Seine flickered in the mist. The river moved steadily, indifferent to treaties, indifferent to names, carrying the city's secrets beneath its bridges. He thought of the prefect's smile, too tight, too cautious. He thought of the newspapers, filling their columns with vague hints of intrigue. And he thought of the man himself, faceless yet everywhere, a ghost, born of forgotten trenches. That night Maigret walked home, slower than usual, his boots heavy against the cobbles. Madame Maigret was waiting with soup kept warm on the stove, her expression calm, but her eyes noting his fatigue. She asked no questions, only ladled the broth and set it before him. As he ate, he felt the warmth spread, but his thoughts remained with the man who carried too many names. He imagined him younger once, uniform ill-fitting, mud on his boots, standing among men who believed borders would hold once cannons fell silent. And now, older, hollowed, carrying a passport that lied with more conviction than most truths. When he lay in bed later, the rumble of the city quiet outside, Maigret stared into the dark and felt the weight of what he could not yet prove. The case was no longer about one man. It was about the residue of war that clung to Europe still, staining men's papers, staining their lives. The inspector closed his eyes, but the faces in the passport photographs flickered behind them, shifting endlessly from one identity to another. The war had ended years ago, yet its shadows had stretched into this night, into this case, into this weary city that had chosen to forget, while men like the stranger carried its memory in forged ink. And Maigret, pipe-cold beside the bed, knew he would have to follow those shadows wherever they led, even if they reached into places the police preferred never to tread. Would the next day brought with it a brittle cold, the kind that made the river shiver in long ripples beneath the bridges and turned the breath of men on the streets into pale clouds that vanished too quickly. Maigret walked slowly along the quay, his hat pulled low, his pipe clamped between his teeth, though it had gone out again. He did not bother relighting it. The summons had been clear, delivered by a young clerk with ink on his cuffs and nerves too raw to conceal. The prefect wanted to see him at once. No explanation given, none needed. The case had grown heavy enough that silence alone could not contain it any more. The prefecture rose stern and pale against the grey sky, its windows tall and narrow, its corridors filled with the echo of boots and the murmur of clerks carrying bundles of papers tied in string. Maigret climbed the stairs with the same deliberate pace he used for everything, his broad frame moving steadily, without hurry. He knew these steps well. He had ascended them in triumph and in reprimand, in days when cases broke like brittle glass, and in nights when nothing came of long hours but silence. He knew the prefect too, knew his smile, knew the way his fingers twitched when matters strayed too close to politics. The office was warm, too warm, the windows closed against the winter air, the stove burning with an efficiency that made the inspector's heavy coat feel suffocating. The prefect stood behind his desk, tall and lean, his suit impeccable, his hair oiled back, with the precision of a man who trusted mirrors more than memory. When he greeted Maigret, it was with that practiced smile, tight, courteous, and utterly without warmth. "Sit, my dear Maigret," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite. "You've been busy." Too busy, some might say. The inspector lowered himself into the chair, resting his hat on his knee, pipe still in his hand. He did not answer at once. He let the prefect fill the silence, for it was in such silences that men revealed themselves. The prefect leaned forward, his elbows on the polished wood, his hands clasped. "This business with the passport, yes, I've heard all of it. A man found in a boarding house, papers that whisper louder than they should, a suitcase full of identities, and now the boulevards murmur, the newspapers hint. I needn't remind you that Paris thrives on rumour, Inspector, but rumour can be more dangerous than fact when it touches the wrong ears." Maigret drew in a slow breath, his chest rising like a tide, and finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Rumour, Prefect, is only dangerous when it is true." The Prefect's smile tightened further. He tapped a finger on the desk once, twice, as though considering whether to scold or to flatter. At last, he settled on neither. "You are a practical man, Maigret. That is why you remain useful to me. But there are lines we do not cross. This passport, this man, it seems to brush against matters beyond your bureau. There are names in those documents that do not belong to police reports. There are interests, shall we say, that prefer the night to the light of inquiry." The inspector said nothing. He struck a match at last, lit his pipe, and let the smoke drift slowly across the office. The prefect waved a hand impatiently, but not because of the smoke. It was because of the silence that pressed heavier with each curl of grey. "You see," the prefect went on, leaning back now, his voice smoother, almost coaxing, "we live in delicate times. Borders are fragile, politics fragile, even alliances among friends. To dig too deep into one man's papers might undo threads that keep the cloth from tearing. You understand this, do you not?" Maigret's eyes, half-lidded, fixed on the prefect's face. "What would you have me do?" The question was not deference, but challenge. The prefect hesitated, then smiled again, but this time the smile wavered at the edges. "I would have you be prudent. Continue, yes, of course, but tread lightly. Do not let the newspapers feed on your work. Do not let the cafes buzz too loudly with your presence. And above all, should you find names that belong to men who dine in finer quarters than the ones you usually haunt, you will close the file quietly, for everyone's sake." The inspector puffed once, the ember of his pipe glowing like a coal in the dim light. He gave no promise, but neither did he refuse. The prefect seemed content with that, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, as if he knew the inspector's silence was not submission, but patience. When Maigret rose to leave, the prefect extended his hand with a politician's grace. "You have my confidence, Inspector. Do not abuse it." The handshake was brief, the fingers dry, the smile rehearsed. Maigret left the office with his pipe still smoking and his coat heavy across his shoulders. In the corridor, clerks hurried with their papers, boots clicked on stone, the machinery of the state turning with its endless grind. Yet beneath it all, the inspector felt the weight of what had not been said. The prefect feared the case, not because of the man with the passport, but because of the shadows behind him. Outside, the air was sharp and clean after the closeness of the office. Maigret paused on the steps, watching the river glint faintly in the afternoon light. He filled his lungs, exhaled, and thought of the prefect's smile, that thin barrier behind which trembled the possibility of scandal. The inspector had lived long enough to know that when the prefect smiled like that, it meant danger not only for those pursued, but also for those who pursued. He turned toward the boulevard, his heavy steps deliberate, his face unreadable. He would not stop. He never had. He would listen to the streets, to the women who passed like shadows, to the men who smoked in silence. The prefect's warnings were like fog, thick at first, but thinning once one walked far enough. And Maigret, steady as the Seine itself, would walk until the fog dissolved, even if what lay beyond was darker still. That night, back at his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Madame Maigret watched her husband carefully as he ate the stew she had prepared. She did not ask what the prefect had said, she never did, but her eyes, patient and calm, searched his face for the heaviness of his thoughts. Maigret ate slowly, spoke little, and when he finished, he filled his pipe and sat by the window. The glow of the lamp lit his profile, deepened the lines of his brow. He thought again of the prefect's smile, uneasy, brittle, a shield against truths the state would rather keep buried. The city outside lay quiet, but beneath the quiet ran currents too strong for any smile to hold back. The rain had returned by the time Maigret stepped out onto the Quai des Orfèvres, its steady fall a soft murmur against the ancient stones, a rhythm as old as the city itself. The Seine lay before him, swollen with the winter rains, its murky waters lapping lazily at the banks, indifferent to the life that pulsed through the streets above. Paris breathed beneath its veil of fog, a city caught between two worlds, the one that spoke aloud, full of newspapers and telegrams, and the one that whispered only to the river, to the darkness behind doors, to the shadows cast by street lamps. The case had drawn its final threads together, and yet, as Maigret walked along the quay, he felt no sense of conclusion. There were answers, yes, fragments pieced together, names spoken in hushed tones, photographs passed between the narrow spaces of hands. But the whole of it was still hidden. The man with the false passport, the one whose name had never been spoken aloud, remained a shape obscured by smoke, a figure shifting from shadow to shadow, always just out of reach. He had been here, Maigret was certain of that, and yet he had never truly belonged to the city, nor to any of the names he carried. He was a foreigner in his own skin, a man who had learned to wear identities, as others wear coats, with a little too much care, with too much precision, until they fit too snugly to be undone. Maigret paused at the edge of the river, staring down at the water. It moved slowly, thick with the debris of the last storm, carrying bits of wood, discarded letters, and even a stray hat that bobbed gently, as if it too were part of the endless current. The river, in its indifferent flow, held all the secrets the city had ever buried, the ones that belonged to criminals and the ones that belonged to men like Maigret, those who walked the fine line between justice and truth. He had reached the end of the trail, or so he thought. The prefect's warnings had echoed in his mind, but they did not hold him back. The case had moved from forgeries and false names to something deeper, something darker. Men who had fought in wars that should have been forgotten, men who had carried with them the weight of borders drawn and erased like chalk on a map. A suitcase found in a room with no name, a passport with a seal too clean to be true, a woman in a blue dress who had waited too long. It all pointed to the same conclusion. The man was not merely hiding, he was running from something much larger, something buried beneath the lies he wore like skin. The rain intensified and Maigret pulled his coat tighter around him. His eyes wandered over the city's quiet outlines, the rooftops blanketed in mist, the street lamps flickering in and out of focus, the alleyways that disappeared into darkness. The inspector felt a strange calm, as though the chase had ended, not because the man had been caught, but because the truth had revealed itself in its own way. The man with the false passport would not be found by following the obvious trail. He had never intended to be caught. Instead, the case had turned inward, and Maigret now understood that the man had never truly been the target. It was the weight of the past that needed to be uncovered, the echoes of a war that had shaped men like him, like the prefect, like all of them. Turning away from the river, Maigret made his way back to the police headquarters. His steps were slower now, the weight of years on his shoulders, the weight of decisions made and questions left unasked. He had seen enough in his career to know that some answers were never meant to be fully understood. The man with the passport had been one such answer, and Paris itself had been his riddle, wrapped in 1,000 forgotten names. As he entered the building, the familiar hum of activity surrounded him. Officers moved through the hallways, their faces tired but focused, their steps purposeful as they carried on with their work. Maigret walked past them, his thoughts still on the case, still on the shadow of the man who had haunted him for weeks. He paused outside his office door, hesitating for a moment before he entered. Inside, the room felt heavier than usual, the weight of silence pressing in on him. He sat at his desk, his hands folding the documents he had been reading, the last few pages of the investigation. He had reached the end of the line, almost, but something lingered, like a faint murmur at the edge of his mind. He pulled open the drawer where the passport now rested, its pages still too perfect, its lies still too sharp. Maigret ran his fingers over the cover, feeling the coolness of the paper, the crispness of its edges. He had held it too many times now, but it had never felt as real as it should. It was as if the passport itself were a lie, something that had never truly existed in the world of men and names, only in the spaces between. He looked out the window again, his gaze sweeping across the grey cityscape. The fog had thickened, and the streets below were lost in the haze. Paris, as it had done so many times before, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. The rain continued to fall, its rhythm steady and relentless. Maigret's mind drifted back to the man in the blue dress, to the woman who had warned him of what lay ahead. He thought of the veteran who had spoken of borders and the way men's identities were shaped by the wars they fought, by the lands they had crossed, by the names they had carried. The case had begun as a mystery of a single false passport, but it had unfolded into something larger, something far older than any of them had anticipated. The man with the forged papers was not the key to the puzzle. He was merely a piece of it, a symbol of the larger truth that had been buried beneath the surface for years. The real question, Maigret now understood, was not who the man was or where he had gone, but what had led him to this point. What had shaped him into the fugitive he had become, running not just from the law, but from something far more dangerous? Maigret stood, the chair groaning beneath him. He opened the window slightly, letting the cool air drift into the room, mingling with the smell of stale tobacco and old paper. The river below was still, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of passing debris. He felt the weight of the case lift from his shoulders, the finality of it settling into his bones. There would be no more chasing, no more questions to ask. The man with the false passport had vanished as completely as a shadow at dawn, leaving behind only the faintest trace in the city's memory. The Seine held its secrets as it always had. And Maigret, for all his years of following the river's flow, knew that there were some things even he could never uncover. The river would take the man's name with it, just as it had taken so many others before. And in time, Paris would forget, as it always did. But Maigret would remember, he always did. He closed the window, turned from the desk, and left the office without another word.